Hi, from New York. This is Nina Khrushcheva, and I'm a curator of a program, Russia on the World Stage, for the Kreisky Forum. And so I'd like to talk to you about Russia on the world stage during the coronavirus. Russia is rather recently came into the news comparing to other countries in terms of infections and coronavirus cases because in the last few weeks the cases increased. What is really interesting here, and I often spoke about this at the Kreisky Forum, is that in some ways Russia is an offspring um, of a European civilization. I mean, clearly, partially in Europe, of a Western culture, but also fights with it all the time. And so trying to follow in Xi Jinping's footsteps really didn't end up being possible for Putin because when the cases started rising up, more leadership was expected, and in fact, he looked, as Russia always often does, look at the West and started mimicking Western behavior rather than the Chinese behavior. So it was the Angela Merkel who was available to the public. It was Emmanuel Macron who was available to the public. Even Giuseppe Conte, Italian prime minister, who was available to the public and whose numbers went up. And so Putin was kind of mimicked those leaders rather than Xi Jinping ultimately. So it is kind of another instance when Russia crisis plans to follow Chinese scenario, or was planning to follow the Chinese scenario, and ended up going European. Of course, another important point, I think, for many countries, and Russia probably particularly, or also very important, that it came around when Europe was readying to celebrate the 75th anniversary of World War II. In Russia, it's a sacred holiday. As you know, the Soviet Union lost over 20 million people in the conflict, and the Russians refer to it as a great patriotic war. Putin is very patriotic war-centric. We know that. We've seen him, kind of flexing the military muscle at all times. And he does play up the rhetoric of Russia needing to defend itself, as it did in 1941, and hence the increase of the military-industrial complex. So, and that, of course, allow him to push that forward. And on May 9, the day that Russia always has most years for decades had a May Day parade, the Victory Day parade. It would be an opportunity, as it has been in many Putin's years, in almost 200, in almost 2 decades, to show off the new tanks and the new hardware, and kind of to propagandistically show that Russia on the world stage is a very scary proposition. So it should, enemies beware. But on May 9th, which was a few days ago, Putin just stood alone next to the eternal flames to commemorate the soldiers, and he was speaking about the sacrifices and the Russian strength, and all of it, quite frankly, looked somewhat unconvincing. I mean, it was very somber, but very unconvincing, because one of the reasons also because he didn't mention coronavirus at all, that Russia has been on the lockdown for over a month, and suddenly he's just there alone. The reason he's there alone, because it was on the lockdown, and yet he didn't mention it, which was a little strange, but also strange because it was a reversal from previous rhetoric at the beginning, when the virus was less present in Russia than it was in other countries, and in other countries in Europe. So at that time, he was very prominently referred to the virus in war terms. He himself was called and kind of addressed by his officials as a supreme commander. He himself spoke about Russia's past victories, and not even World War II, but all the way back a millennium ago, when Russia was just a nascent state. And he was speaking about those in regard to coronavirus, which is once again kind of showed his militaristic mindset. At the same time, as I said, did not mention coronavirus this time around, which on one hand strange and unconvincing, on the other hand makes sense because this is a war celebration, and Russians really put a lot of effort into celebrating 75th year of victory with a great gusto, and suddenly they don't. And so he obviously didn't want to invite the comparison because the Soviet Union defeated the Nazis, and his Russia, or he himself, has very hard time defeating a tiny little virus. But what's also interesting with the war rhetoric, that it's not just Russia. I mean, it is 75th anniversary, and many countries in Europe celebrate that, and they celebrate that also in the lockdown. But also what's remarkable is that because most countries really got caught flat-footed by the virus, and now they're using the rhetoric of fighting the Nazis in World War II as the kind of as something that can help them fight the coronavirus. So all of this is pure propaganda war. Because we're all asked with the war, we should be asked to rally around the national flag, and also it is kind of perceived that the population would be less likely to question the failing governments, and so instead the doctors, the nurses, the postmen, the postwomen, the people in the grocery store are designated as heroes and soldiers, which also turn them into martyrs. It is a health crisis as coronavirus, and it as giant as it is, as global as it is, as I've never experienced as it is. These people are not soldiers; they're immediate responders, and that should be protected by resources and infrastructure, not really be designated to go to the front line as they are now, as if in a war. Sort of one of the last things that I want to note, to point that there are women in many countries, women who are in charge in Germany, in Australia, in Norway, in Iceland, those countries that do much better. Not because women are better leaders than men. That would be a sexist statement. It's not that I don't believe it, but I don't think we had enough women on the world stage to really make a proven argument. But so not necessarily because of that, but they deal with the problem and not with the illusion that if they decorate their actions with a tough narrative, suddenly the problem will just go away. The virus is not Nazi Germany. It is not afraid of armies, and it's not a political adversary. It cannot really be intimidated by a tweet, as Donald Trump seemed to be often hoping. Thank you very much. Stay safe. And this is Nina Khrushcheva from Russia on the World Stage.